The Hello, friends. Welcome back to part three of our Modern Masters series, and I'm very happy to welcome my good friend, the Unknown Guy Reborn. How are you doing?
Oh, yeah, good. Yourself?
Yeah, not too bad. Getting down to the last few of our top players, and today we're looking at numbers four and five. And we'll also, at the end of that, talk about some honorable mentions. That is, a lot of amazing players who, just didn't quite qualify to top 10, but are wonderful players in their own right. And we're going to recognize some of those just as we prepare to get into the finales. So I've got Taga here as my expert. He is going to be going through these games and giving his wonderful in-depth analysis as to what made them so special. So, without further ado, our number five spot goes to Penny Seven. And this gentleman has been around the scene for a few years. I remember it would have been around 2021. He was starting to get very good. And what made him, I suppose, set apart from others was he's not really a fast player. He really had a love of the game, and you can see he's done various studies, particularly on endgame studies. I think he really fell in love with how anti-chess can give us this really technically brilliant side of how to win the endings, and he's only gone from strength to strength, even though he probably took a fair chunk of a rest for some time, concentrate on studies, but he came back with a bang recently, and he is the latest anti-chess world champion. And we will now look at one of his games. So over to you, Tugger. Let's hear about Penny Seven's play.
All right. So in this game, this is Penny versus Preslov, and we've taken this from the World Championship this year. And Preslov starts the game with E3. And normally at this level, especially in the World Championship, you get games that are B6, C5, or E6. It's one of those three. You're gonna have to deal with it. Anything else, and you play a little bit worse than sorry, you'll get worse positions than your skill may dictate. But instead, we see b5 from Penny, a very rare move at this level, and Full takes back, and we see Bishop a6, the Bosnian defense.
My favorite. This is the only opening I play.
Well, we'll see if you play it similarly to Penny does.
Hmm.
Bishop takes d7, knight takes d7, and Preslov goes for the main line d3. Bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, and here there's three main moves. You can either play h6, queen b8, or rook b8. c6 is also playable by computer standards, but not for humans. Same with h5. And
How
here
about how
Penny
about
opts
G how
for
about G6?
g6. There's a lot of it's really easy to take advantage of as white after g6. Queen takes, f takes. White is power. Sorry, black is powerless to stop knight e2, knight g3. It's very easy to just get a really easy position after knight h4. Sorry, knight h5, g4, f3, and you have the stack lined up. And there's no way you can really stop it. Even if you try and delay with h5 and take, maybe get the rook out, white can simplify down on the queen side with moves like e4, bishop f4, and bring the bishop in with the amount of time that they have to respond. Obviously, e4 you can't play right away, but you can do it after g6 because f5 is double covered.
That means it's time to change my theory or to upgrade it.
Well, maybe you'll see some example lines here. We see h6, queen takes d7, king takes d7, and knight h3, which is pretty much the strongest move at this point. You threaten knight g5 and to release the rook to come in this way and take all the pieces. So Penny responds with the only sensible move, f6. g5 is playable. Uh, it's just not good. f6 is by far better. With the point being that after knight g5, you can take with the f pawn and your rook won't be revealed. So we see knight c3 instead, just a developing move, and we want to try and control this king from getting out, um, and blocking the bishop's path. If the king can get to e6 and black lands e5, it'll probably be fine. So Penny takes away Preslov's strong knight with g5, knight takes f takes, and Preslov continues to develop on the queen side with a4 around this knight. Uh, with the idea that, well, he wants to move his king somewhere, and wants to keep all of the material on the board, hence his queen, so he gets the queen out of the way of the d file so that he doesn't trade it for a weaker piece like the bishop. So uh, Prezlov plays b3, maybe intending to reroute the knight, um, maybe in like knight a2, also giving some space for the bishop because there's no b or d pawns to take the knight away. And we see the point behind queen e8 start to form. He plays g4, and he wants to try and get rid of the pressure from this rook. So how does g4 do that? Well, after g3, white threatens to play king e2, rook g1, and rook g2, which would be mate. After there's a couple ideas with bishop d7 and bringing this rook over. So instead, you play queen h5, and now this attacks the h pawn, and white is forced to do something about it. They either lose the rook or they lose the chance to do, um, or to bring in their king and sack this way. There is one defense to this, which is rook g1, queen takes, king e2, and now you can't take the rook because bishop d2 is mate. After takes, again, there's the same idea, and now you're moved behind. Oop. So instead, or so black has a chance, white has a chance to come out advantageously from this, but instead we see h3, which is a little bit more of a natural move, and this trades off the rook for the queen while still keeping white's pawn structure intact. And now Preslov begins his plan to bring out the bishop and the rook and try and get this either, excuse me, and try and get this pawn to promote or take advantage of this weak h6 pawn. And so Preslov pushes it forward now that the f3 squared is covered twice. It is safe to play against g4, and now you have another space to bring out one of your three pieces. Preslov takes the center with e4, and we see a trade of dark squared bishops. And now, what is the plan in this position for both sides? Well, we see that white has a couple of pieces that could be doing a little bit more, especially on this queen side. And these are namely the knight and the b and a pawns. So white's goal is either, if they can't focus on this pawn, which is one of the ways to go, the other would be to reroute the knight maybe to b1 and start moving these pawns forward, just because they are going to be putting the pressure on the queen side while you have the king side locked down already. And black wants to improve their three worst pieces, which are these two h pawns and the knight. The knight doesn't really have anywhere to go except for h6, and even then they can't. It can only really jump between these two squares because these pawns control them really well. So Preslov takes the center with e5, and here Penny plays a very crucial move, which is rook d6. You get rid of the rook taking up the h6 square. You get rid of all the h file pressure, and you fix your structure with c takes d6. Now you no longer have three isolated pawns. You have two that can press down the center together, and one a pawn, which will be stopping the advancement of the queenside pawns later on. So we see g4 from Preslov, getting rid of the g pawn, and knight b5, attacking two weak points at once. He doesn't want these two pawns together, or maybe he can pull out the rook and trade it for a pawn or two. So we see rook d8 not allowing that to happen, and king takes. White continues to press on with c4, with the threat being to release all the pieces. They'd both be in loose cannons. And sidestepping that, and after c5 with the same threat, now rook e8 is viable because there's no b pawn to chain the attack with. We see a5, and now knight f6 developing. When he develops his knight, trying to get it out of that bad corner. b4, just pressure keeps piling on. a6, king d2, rook h8. Both players are kind of shuffling, trying to see how they should push forward. f3, and Preslov has calculated that this is good for him, maybe with a win, because we see c6, and he gives up three pawns at once, which all of the pressure he now has is gone. So he's confident he has a win here. And after a6, knight d5, king d1, knight f4, black is going after the king, trying to trade the king for knight, and white would be a little hopeless there, as it's rook and pawn versus quite a few pieces. So we see a7, and Penny's best move of the game by far is rook h4. And why is this so good? Well, it's actually because everything else, well, there's a hidden threat in this position. And that is some kind of promotion. So there is a difference between rook h4 and rook h5, which we'll examine, which is knight promotion. And everything is covered too many times. The pawns are too far apart for each other. Uh, and now black is kind of in trouble because their whole plan is to push forward, but now they're getting pressed on from the back when all of their resources are being sent down. So what happens? King d5, maybe, to try and run away from the knight, but you get hit with rook a4 and knight c7. And now the king is protected twice. So is this square. It can't run anywhere, and the king will sacrifice itself on the next move. If you give it up on b6, then d5 is captured twice. And if you give it up on c7, now your pieces are weak. White threatens mate in a variety of ways. Rook h6, which undefends the pawn and brings in the other rook, is too slow because the pawns are too far away from promotion, and white will eventually win this. So Penny spots this threat and plays rook h4, and now you can sack on the king on c7 because the b pawn is no longer protected. Every other move loses because it either defends one square too many times or doesn't address the fact um, that there's just mate looming. If you get lazy and let the pawn promote, then the rook can just sacrifice itself on the file. Same with the king. So rook h4 is the best move of the game. So we see a king instead, king d5, rook a4, and Trezlov is confident now that he has a draw. Two kings draws almost anything if they're together. So Prezlov's goal is going to be to try and bring the two kings closer. We see king e6, which is a thematic move in these endgames. In order to stop the king from sacrificing itself on the pawn, the king needs to be one square on top of it. So we see king c1, a3, and black just needs to get those pawns as far down the board as possible. Knight h5, king a5, and black sacks the rook, knowing that it'll be enough. These two pawns will hold for a draw. We see f1 king, king b3, h2, king c3, king e5, which is a little cheeky, just threatens the draw. Black goes king 3 d2 instead, a little more confident this way. King g2, king cd1, and now things are not so clear. This king is on the edge of the board, and it's protected by this king, and there's a lot of double covered squares. Not that these two are exactly relevant at the moment, but the kings are too close to each other on the edge. And so we see knight g3, which attacks one of those squares. It doesn't force the king to give one of themselves up, because you can't chain to these two. But we see knight h5, king e1, and now knight promotion, which is another good move. Knights are kind of similar to kings, in fact, how they're good in groups, but the advantage is that the knight has a slightly more range than the king at the cost of being a little clumsier. So you already have two kings. You can get a little bit more with those knights. The kings can protect the knights quite well. So we see king ed2 and the game winner, knight f2. Now, black is forced to give one of the kings up because they both will reach d3 no matter what. And from there, you can chain all of your pieces together. So we see king dd1, knight takes d1, king takes d1, and from here, it's a conversion. Two kings, a knight versus, and anything else versus a lone king is winning. Lone king usually loses against anything that's not a bishop or another king, or winning against a knight. So we see king e4, king c2, king e5, king b3, and white offers the draw here. Uh, and this is because this pawn is going to be incredibly hard to push. Penny has around 45 seconds on the clock, and maybe he's not confident in pushing it all the way up, because it does get quite dicey. You do have to keep the king in front of the pawn the whole time, and there's a challenge at the end. But Penny elects to press on with king f3. We see king b4, king e4, king b5, and e5. Now we've pushed the pawn up and we've achieved that same endgame structure. The king one square in front of the pawn. We see king b4, king e2, trying to not allow the king anywhere on this f-file. King b3, king 4 f3. This is fine now because this king covers the square to chain the pawn. King b4, knight f4, disallowing the king from coming in behind the pawn. King bb3, e4, pushing. King b2, king g2, and he's very patient here. It's very easy to just play something like e3 and immediately lose because everything's double covered. So it's nice that Benny correctly does not push the pawn. King b3, king e1, king b2, e3. And now the tough challenge at this point is getting the king off this file, because this king is shouldering him from coming this way, so can't go there. And if you step close to the f file, maybe there's some opportunity for the king to come to the c file and sacrifice itself if your pieces are not close enough. So you need to reroute something to cover these two squares, or at the very least, this one. So we see king b3, e2. Now this is fine. There's no There's no way for the king to come in. But we see king c4 anyway, which is a little bit of a trap, but not at this level. The point being, if you play knight d3, this king cannot defend or undefend the pawn. So we see knight d5 only move, king d2, and now king promotion. This is textbook win from here on out. You have three kings versus one king, and we'll see Penny use this technique. First, he wastes a move to get opposition into this kind of structure. You have like this V shape with kings directly opposite this one. And whichever way the king steps, the opposite king goes and cuts him off from coming back to that square. We see king c5, and the kings get closer together. And as the king falls down the ranks, you try and recreate that same structure again. So we see it here. And now the same thing happens. Breslov goes to the left this time, so we see the right king come down and take away the d6 square. And the same thing happens. The king gets shouldered to the edge, one rank down, and we get the same structure. We keep going. And eventually we get the king to the edge, where we do the same thing, push the king all the way to the corner, and achieve this nice symmetric formation. And from here, white resigns, as it is mate in three.
It's a beautiful, fitting ending, befitting of somebody of Penny's endgame knowledge and skill. So wonderful. All right, and okay, the time we've still got 10 minutes. So the next one, number 4, and this gentleman needs no introduction. He's been one of the premier anti-chess players for so many years, two-time world champion, um, often top 10 for countless times, former president of the IAF, and that is Mr. We like to call him Flo, but his handle is ChangeOpening. And let's see one of his special games now that Tug has found.
So we'll be taking this game from the 12K member arena for the Leechess Antichess team, and it is played against Why Do I Play Here? And in this game, we start with c4, explosive. Flo responds back with c5, and we see g3, g6, the symmetrical variation, b4, c takes, bishop a3, pawn takes, knight takes a3, and Flo elects to go for the same thing here with b5, pawn takes b5, knight a6, and we have a completely symmetrical position. Why Do I Play Here decides to break the tension first and play g4. And black has quite a few plans here. You can trade pawns on the king side, you can try and develop, you can try and chase this knight around, but we see Flo take the open file with rook b8. The point being that all these squares are double covered. So even if you give the knight up on b5, there's no danger, because the rook will eventually have to lose itself. Why Do I Play Here shows why she played g4 and plays g5, which lures the rook to the other side, not wanting to give up the rook or the queen, and instead will give up a knight or a bishop. And we see queen a4 instead, going for a race. Takes g1, forced. And here, Flo correctly calculates that you need to take the bishop. The point being, if you take the rook, the queen has a lot more options. She can take on g6 safely now. And you're a little stuck. It's not too bad, but definitely taking the bishop is the better move, considering how the back rank is so weak. If you can get the king to stay put on the file, you will be golden. So we see takes bishop correctly, takes g6, and here you have two options. You can either take the king for material, or you take the queen for initiative. Both are fine, and Flo elects to choose to take the queen. We see king takes, and now the problem is that white has these two rooks that are really weak, and if black can somehow squeeze in queen b8 with some other piece reaching the b file, it's going to be over. So white has to somehow move the rooks off the file, that way the king can get off the back rank and you can fully develop. And so that's what we see. We see h5 trying to activate some pieces, a4 getting space for the rook, a5 stopping the pawn from going any further and giving up the queen if necessary. It's a lot easier if this pawn is stuck. So we see rook a3, knight h6, and we're just going to press forward. King e1, queen c7 going for this pawn and realizing that the rook is kind of trapped and it'll probably, this is a safe move. So we see rook f1, queen takes h2, rook a2, and then queen takes f2. And now these pawns are going to be rolling. They are your assets and you need to push them down the board. And that's exactly what we see our champion do. g5, rook b1, getting out of the way of these pawns, allowing the king to move. That way we're not threatening maybe some tactic with knight f5. And we see g4. King doesn't want to sacrifice itself, so he goes to e1. h4, e3. Pawns keep rolling. h3. Rook a3, f7. King f7, king e2, king g6. Coming forward, advancing all the pieces, supporting these pawns. We see d4 trying to take some space in the center as counterplay. Note that e5 is not possible because of the rook that was placed on a3. So instead, we see g3. Flow does not carry, just pushes the pawns. King d3, d5, freezing the pawns in the center. Note that there's no chains. This pawn needs at least 4 squares to promote, and there's only 3 pieces on the board, so you're usually fine to do this. We see king d2, h2, just steamrolling those pawns. Rook b4, maybe trying to put something together, giving up a rook. And a5, just pushing the pawn. Uh, the queen side was a lot more locked up. So why do I play here? Gives up 2 of her rooks just to free up some space and some moves, really, because you're kind of running out against these pawns. They're just so strong. We see e4, d takes e4, d5, and why do I play here asks a question. What do you plan to do here? You can ignore this pawn and just push your own, and that requires you to win a 5 pawn endgame with 4 pieces. So we see Flo give up one of them, and then he goes after the king, which is the correct play here. The king is White's only good piece, so if you can take it and trade it off, maybe lure him to capture some pawns in the way, that's probably your best idea. And we see e7, which deflects the bishop away from the king. King c1, rook b8, trying to trade the king for any piece of material to leave. Why do I play here with just one piece? King d1, avoiding that. e3, a6, and now we see bishop b4, threatening a plethora of tactics. We see king e1 giving up the king, a7, and h1 equals rook, a8 king, or ab8 king. And so now Flo has a bit of a jam because he has 3 pawns that are all ready to go. They'll be rooks, maybe bishops, maybe knights, maybe kings. We don't know yet. But his bishop is kind of trapped, and his knight and king are on the edge of the board. So let's see how he solves this. Plays a2, king c7, king f7, king c6, and he gets his first pawn into a rook. King b5, trying to go after, or forcing at least one of the pieces to get themselves up. So we see the weaker piece, the bishop, be sacrificed with bishop b4, king takes b4, and rook a5 anyway, which is a critical move, because if the rook were to stay on this file, you pose risks with the back rank. It's just a better, more principled move. If the king comes closer, you kind of have to move your rooks back, and you get into this spot where your king and knight are too far away to help with the lone rook against the pawns. So rook a5 is definitely the correct move, and we see e2, and another rook is being made, and now it's a lot easier to defend this one pawn than the 2 isolated ones. We see king c3, rook h5, king c2, rook e6, and how does he manage to do this from here? We see g2, king c2, knight g4, shouldering the king away with as many pieces as possible. King c3, rook h8, preemptively sidestepping any of these moves. King d4 is probably the most dangerous because both the rook and the knight control that 1 square, and so you want to leave it away from here. So we see king c2, king e6, king c3, rook f7, and there's just some shuffling. That way the knight can maneuver properly. After king c2, king e5. Now the king comes forward, knight e4, king e3, king b5, and g1 rook. So now we have 3 rooks versus knight king, or 3 rooks, knight king versus king. And this is by no means trivial, but you certainly have the material to do it. King b4, rook h6, cutting off the king from going this way. We see king a5, knight f6 is the point, and now you've kind of won some time. The king has gone down to the edge, and king b6, he's closer to the corner, and so you can win time. Rook c7, knight d7, you give up your weakest piece, and you play rook h2, and now this is a textbook win. You have 2 rooks, a king versus a king, and all you have to do is force the king down rank by rank, and eventually sacrifice. So we see king c6, king d3, king d6, rook f2, and we want to stop the king from getting too close. So we see king e7, the point being that you can sacrifice a rook or 2, but you can't chain it to your original king. So you play rook c2, preventing the king from coming back to the same rank, or to the same spot. You can still play king f6, rook b1, and we see this key move here, rook b6. And what this does is that no matter which way the king steps, the rook is always able to reach the last rank. And so you can sacrifice it because your king is 1 square away to keep the opposition. So Why do I play here? It chooses king h5. We see rook h6 and the crucial move king e5. And from here, flow converts nicely. We see rook c3 preventing the king from coming up. Rook c4 again, taking the opposition with a waiting move. Rook d4, king h7, cutting off, and we see the same thing completed for a win. Very nice game by Flo and great endgame conversion.
And it's wonderful because this game really illustrates the beauty of anti-chess, where you have one king left and you have so many other pieces on the board. And if you're a beginner player, you might think, "Oh, well, I'm definitely winning, right?" Well, no, at the top level, all that control, and as long as you're very careful, Flo showed us that even though he is probably well known for theory, he has a immense opening knowledge. His endgame skills are truly excellent as well. Right, so those are our fourth and fifth players for the top 10. Next, we will talk about honorable mentions.